In the spring of 1891, beneath the blazing sun of Cerberus Creek, a young woman was being sold by her own kin. Her uncle's words cut deeper than any whip, until one quiet ranch hand stepped out of the crowd. He didn't come to buy, he came to change her fate. Watch till the end to uncover the hardships this girl will face, and tell us where you're watching from, partner. Now saddle up, 'cause this story's just beginning.
Cerberus Creek, New Mexico Territory, spring of 1891. The wind that gusted through the one main street of Cerberus Creek carried grit and the faint coppery scent of the smelter that ran upriver. It was a day of stark, unmoving heat where the shadows lay short and sharp. Townsfolk were packed into the makeshift auction yard, drawn by the grim promise of a rare sight, a human being offered for sale, alongside a brace of mules and a few branded steers. In the center stood a woman named Alara Vance, 27, in a travel-stained heavy-spun gray dress. She was tall, with a spine straight as a surveyor's line, and eyes the color of creek mud after a storm, tired but not broken. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, but the tension was visible in the white-knuckle grip of her jaw. Beside her, her uncle, a thick man named Tobias with a face blotched by sun and spirits, stood with a proprietary leer. "Final bid." "Don't be shy, gentlemen," Tobias crowed, his voice grating. "The girl's got solid bones and knows how to keep a house, but she's cursed with empty arms. Spent 7 years trying for a single chick, nothing to show for it. So no fancy talk of heirs. She's a good worker though, can shoot a rattler at 40 yards and she's got every tooth in her head. That's worth something on this hard land." A painful silence settled, heavier than the dust. The married women averted their gaze, clutching their younger children tighter. The air throbbed with unspoken judgment. Alara had faced this fire before, the scarlet brand of failure she'd worn since her first few barren years. She'd learned to hold her breath through the shame, to be stone when they threw names at her. Near the back of the small crowd, an imposing figure stood apart. His name was Pat Healy, 39 years old, a man whose face carried the permanent squint of one who had spent his life staring into distance. He was not a cowboy, but a foreman from the north, dressed in clean denim and a dark, dust-resistant serge coat. His presence was one of quiet, formidable weight. He had a reputation for honesty that stretched from the territory line back to Kansas. He rarely spoke and never smiled. Pat did not move, did not appraise her like a piece of equipment. He simply walked to the worn table Tobias was using, reached inside his coat, and with a swift, economical gesture, deposited a canvas sack heavy with silver dollars, enough to buy 3 of Tobias's best cattle. Tobias gaped, counting the coins quickly. "Just like that? No haggling? You know the terms, fella. No refunds when the cradle stays empty." Pat didn't look at Alara, his shadow long and cool across the packed earth. "I am aware," he stated, his voice a low rumble, devoid of judgment. He merely turned and started walking toward his wagon. Tobias grabbed Alara's elbow. "Get along, girl. You belong to him now." He snatched up the canvas sack, the sound of the metal coins clanking a final, brutal music. Alara stood for a moment, letting the sound of the scattering crowd wash over her. No one cared where she went, only that she was gone. She picked up her meager bundle, a leather satchel holding a few clothes, a worn Bible, and a tin-type photograph of her long-gone sister, and followed the man with the quiet boots. His rig was a heavy practical wagon near the water trough, pulled by a stout pair of draft horses. She climbed onto the bench without a word, settling beside the broad, silent man. Pat offered her a metal flask. "Take a drink. We've got a long haul to the ranch." The water was fresh, cool, and tasted faintly of mountain juniper. They cleared the edge of the settlement and drove onto the open barren lands. The sky stretched out, an immense empty blue bowl. The trail was marked only by the wind-sculpted sagebrush and the occasional cry of a hawk. "Why me?" Alara finally asked, her voice raspy from disuse, still staring straight ahead. Pat's hands were large, resting loosely on the reins. The knuckles of his left hand were ridged with an old, deep scar. He took a long moment before answering, his profile shadowed by the brim of his hat. "I've got 5 strays," he said. "They need a hand." Alara's breath hitched. "I'm not a nursemaid." "No," Pat agreed, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were a startling clear gray. "You're someone who won't be cruel. That's the only job requirement." By sunset, they reached a cluster of buildings tucked into a scrub-covered draw. The ranch house, a low-slung structure of sun-baked adobe, looked like it was sighing under the weight of the years. Behind it stood a stout corral and a stone-built smokehouse. The only sound was the incessant mournful creak of the old windmill turning in the dry wind. Pat dismounted, tied the horses, and walked straight to the house. Alara followed, her worn boots scraping the packed dirt of the yard. The front door was less a door and more a thick, patched wool blanket stretched across the frame, keeping out the worst of the night chill. Inside, 5 children turned to stare. 4 boys, 1 girl, their faces flickering in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. They were a range of ages, from a girl of perhaps 11 to a silent tow-headed toddler. They were unnervingly still. "This is Alara," Pat announced, his voice carrying surprising softness. "She'll be staying." The smallest boy, little Finn, maybe 4, detached himself and stumbled to Pat, wrapping his arms around the foreman's thigh. Pat effortlessly bent, lifting the child with one arm, and gestured toward a dark corner with the other. "Your room's back there. Water bucket's full. It's been heated." Alara climbed the rickety ladder that served as stairs. The room was small, a cot, a dented basin, and a window, with a view of nothing but a long empty stretch of fence line. She set her satchel down, and sat, her body still humming with the nervous energy of the market. She did not weep, but the hands clenched in her lap shook, the involuntary reaction to a fear that was slowly giving way to a strange unnamed quiet. The next morning was a haze of wood smoke, burnt coffee, and the sharp, metallic odor of something singed in the cook stove. The cabin was alive with activity, soft thuds, scuffling feet, and whispered conversations punctuated by sharp coughs. Alara moved with a cautious stiffness. She was charting an unknown landscape, who was a heavy sleeper, who would cry over spilled milk, who liked their oatmeal thick or thin. The children watched her in an unsettling silence. Silas, the eldest, stood against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze a challenge too, grown up for his 14 years. Liam and Toby huddled over a scratched wooden game, casting quick, calculating looks her way. The girl, Sarah, sat near the hearth, fiercely clutching a frayed, embroidered piece of linen. Only Finn, the youngest, hovered, silently mirroring her movements as she tried to navigate the small kitchen. She was a disaster in the kitchen. Her bread dough lay flat and lifeless. The beans dissolved into a gray slop. She knocked over the coffee pot, scalding her hand on the iron grate. She later tried mending a tear in one of the boys' shirts, jabbing the needle deep into her finger before losing it entirely beneath the stove. She did not rage. She only pressed her lips tight and swept the floor until the ache settled deep in her shoulders. That afternoon she tried to lift a heavy iron pot of boiled vegetables. Her grip gave way. The pot crashed, steam and scalding contents spraying across the rough wood floor. The crash was deafening. The children froze. Alara stood paralyzed, waiting for the inevitable, the shouted rebuke, the familiar explosion of temper she had lived under for so long. The door opened. Pat stepped in. Alara looked from the mess to him, bracing herself. Pat said nothing. He crouched down, picked up the pot, scraped the remaining food into the slop bucket, and began to wipe the floor with a clean rag. "It's a meal," he said, his voice level. "We'll eat something else." He walked back out to the yard. Alara stood for a long minute, the dish rag slowly slipping from her numb fingers. The heat still burned in her throat, but this time, it was not the searing shame of failure. It was something cool and baffling, something for which she had no language. That evening, after the scrubbed pots had been stacked and the children tucked into their corners, Alara sat on the porch. The night air was dry and crisp. The stars overhead were immense and cold, sharp points of light that scraped the roofline. She failed to hold back the tears that finally came. Later she moved through the cabin on stocking feet. Silas was snoring softly. Liam mumbled. Finn was curled up, one thumb near his lips, a relic of a time when the universe was only 2 arms. Sarah stirred, letting out a small feverish whimper. Her forehead was burning, too hot. Alara slipped into the narrow hall. Pat was already there. "She's burning," Alara whispered, urgency overriding caution. "I need feverfew, and a clean linen cloth. Now." He didn't hesitate. No questions. no doubt about her skill. He turned, and within minutes she had everything. He banked the fire, crushed the herbs, and held the kettle steady. He watched as Alara soaked a linen square and pressed the cool dampness to the girl's brow. Pat took Sarah into his lap, cradling her small shrunken body, humming a tune as old as the desert. He did not move for hours, not when the child shivered, not when the fever seemed to spike, not even when his own shoulders slumped with fatigue. He was an immovable rock against the storm. By the first pale light of dawn, Sarah opened her eyes. Her lips cracked. "Oatmeal," she rasped. Pat stood in the doorway, a shadow against the rising sun. The tension that had held his body rigid for hours finally released. He didn't speak a word, but his eyes fixed on Alara, a long, considering gaze. She saw a flicker of something in them. Recognition, maybe, or a profound gratitude. She was too drained to smile or flinch. She simply nodded and turned back to the girl, who was already slipping back into sleep in her arms. The following morning, Alara came downstairs to find a kettle already steaming. Beside it, a plain tin mug and a piece of paper, folded once. 2 words were scratched onto the paper in a stiff, self-conscious hand. "Much obliged." No name, no sign-off. She held the note for a beat, a quiet heat spreading through her chest. She sat down, cupped the mug, and sipped slowly. The tea was strong, earthy, and warm. Through the small glassless window, the barren land stretched, the wind whispering through the wild grama grass. Something in her, long knotted and frozen, began to soften. Later that day, she was rinsing clothes behind the cabin when little Finn trotted up, his arms raised high. "Mama Maple," he declared, his voice bright with absolute certainty. Alara turned, startled. He wrapped his arms around her legs and beamed as if he had just named the sun. She didn't correct the strange title. She bent and pulled him close, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Alara smiled, a genuine, unguarded curve of the lips. A new name as summer ripened the land. The house began to find its equilibrium. Alara's hands found their rhythm. Her sourdough bread began to climb in the pans. Her stews stayed whole. She taught the children letters by the flickering light of the hearth, helping Silas trace his full name in the soft dirt of the yard. She sang low melodic songs as she patched their worn clothes. She braided Sarah's long hair into 2 clean ropes, securing them with bits of brightly colored thread she found in an old chest. She learned their quiet territories. Toby wept when he was hungry. Liam stole when he felt ignored. Sarah became silent when she missed her mother. None of them questioned who she was. They watched what she did. They noted how she stayed. The first time one of them said it, it came out as naturally as breathing. Liam handed her a water dipper and murmured, "Here, Mama." The small kitchen went silent for a single heartbeat. He didn't correct himself. Neither did Alara. The next day, Silas said it, gruffly, then Sarah, and finally, Finn, whose heart had already decided her name. It was Mama now. No ceremony, no formal adoption, just the quiet, persistent naming of a reality that had taken root. That night, Pat sat on the porch, working a piece of wood with a sharp knife. Alara came out to sit beside him. "Do you ever think about riding out?" he asked, not looking up. "I did," she admitted. "For months when I first got here, every night." He nodded once, his eyes still on his hands. "Why didn't you?" Alara looked out at the dark fields where the new rope swing hung from the sturdy oak. "Because for the first time," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "no one is asking me to be anything other than what I am." A few nights later, under a hazy moon, Alara took a bucket to the well. She didn't see the shadow until it was too late. Jesse Quinn, the drunken trapper, leaning against the fence. "Didn't think Pat had let his new property wander," he slurred, stumbling toward her. "Figured you'd end up out here," Alara warned him back. But he lunged, his rough hand clamping around her wrist. Suddenly the barn door slammed open. Pat was there. In one swift movement he struck Jesse Quinn across the jaw. The trapper dropped like a stone. Pat stood over him, chest heaving, blood trailing from his own tight fist. He ignored Quinn and looked only at Alara. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hand shook from the grip. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Pat stepped to her, He slowly wrapped his red bandana around her bruised wrist. "No one touches you," he said, his voice low. "Not unless you say they can." He shook his head. "Damn fool," he muttered, not at her, but at the world. Inside, Alara cleaned his knuckles in silence. "You didn't have to fight," she said. "He put his hand on you. You don't like fighting. I like it even less when someone makes you afraid." Alara pressed the cloth onto his skin harder. "I cried out there," she admitted, voice catching. "But not because I was scared, because no one's ever stood up for me like that." Pat looked up, his eyes unguarded. She finished bandaging his hand. "I won't have it," he said quietly. "A man like that thinking he can do that to you." Alara smiled faintly. Her heart was inexplicably light, despite her aching wrist. Next morning, Alara was kneading dough when a scream split the quiet. "Gideon!" She sprinted outside. The neighbor's boy lay twisted by the woodpile, the heavy splitting maul near his leg, blade streaked red. Alara knelt instantly, mind sharp. Pat rushed over, his face pale but his hands steady, scooping the boy up. "Boil water, blankets, now." Alara moved with precision. She gathered herbs, sterilized linens, and worked beside Pat as he set the boy's broken bone. She held Gideon's hand, whispering comfort as the cabin filled with the smell of blood and antiseptic herbs. She stayed focused until the boy finally slept, his fever broken. When the crisis passed, Pat sank into a chair, his hands stained. He looked at Alara, exhausted, strong, the absolute pillar of their survival. He loved her wholly in that moment, seeing the life she had built where her body could not. "Alara," he said, his voice raw. She turned, and the dam broke. She cried, not tears of shame, but cleansing tears of finding sanctuary. She walked to him, burying her face in his chest, weeping for the hard years past and the safety she finally felt. Pat held her fiercely. The next day, Pat put his prized silver pocket watch on the table. "The children and I bought you. That's a truth, but you bought your own choice. This is your fare. You can leave any time." Alara looked at the watch, then at his earnest face. "I won't take it," she said, gently pushing it back. "My fare was paid 2 nights ago when you stood for me. I found my name here, Pat. I found my heart here." Pat's hand closed over hers. A genuine smile broke through his reserve. "Alara, will you stay? Not as a hand, but as my wife." She leaned on his shoulder, looking out at the wild barren lands. "There's only home," she whispered. The children flooded in. Finn ran up to Pat. "Mama Maple." Pat scooped up the boy, his eyes shining as he looked at Alara. She laughed, a new free sound. They stood there, a strange scarred, found family. The cradle remained empty, but the house was full.